Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're checking out a surprise new release from PWNAGE, the UltraGlide Pyramid Glass Pad. Now this pad was a rather unexpected move from PWNAGE as they've never made a glass pad before, only a few fabric pads. Now according to PWNAGE, the UltraGlide is supposed to be a direct competitor to GLSSWRK's offerings, specifically the KAZEMI. Now the UltraGlide's performance is very similar to the KAZEMI, but there's a very good reason as to why the pads feel so similar, and this is where the UltraGlide gets a little murky for me, as while the pad performs great, it might be the lowest effort clone I've ever seen from a peripheral brand. So while the pad feels good, the UltraGlide does feel uninspired and rather generic, rather than a truly unique competitor to the KAZEMI and the other glass pads on the market. So today we're going to talk all about why the UltraGlide and the KAZEMI are so similar, as well as why the UltraGlide feels so generic, and much more in today's episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, as a reminder, as always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. And if you enjoy the review of the PWNAGE UltraGlide and want to see more reviews like this, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. Alright, well let's go ahead and get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. Now to start off, I wanted to talk about cloning. Cloning isn't anything new. We've seen countless brands clone other brands' products, but in most cases when a clone is developed, the copying brand often changes the art style, coloring, or some other aspect of the product to make it unique. But sometimes you'll see a brand just make a very low effort copy of an existing product, and that's exactly what's happened here with the UltraGlide. Now to be abundantly clear, I'm not biased towards GLSSWRK or any other glass pad brand. Ironically enough, I actually work very closely with PWNAGE and I've been part of several of their test groups for some of their upcoming products, so if anything I should be biased towards PWNAGE, but regardless of the brand or my relationship with a brand, I'm going to call out a cheap clone when I see one, and the UltraGlide in my opinion is just that. The UltraGlide is a GLSSWRK's KAZEMI clone, as close as PWNAGE could legally make. Both pads are made in the same factory and they have the exact same design and overall build. The only difference between these two pads is the art and a very slight differencing with the pad surfacing. Now given GLSSWRK's success recently, I understand why PWNAGE wanted to clone the KAZEMI, specifically as there are large gaps in GLSSWRK's release cycle, so PWNAGE can siphon off some market share by offering a KAZEMI clone in between GLSSWRK's launches, but it just feels lazy the way PWNAGE has gone about doing so here with the UltraGlide. The factory that produces the KAZEMI and the UltraGlide can make a wide variety of glass pads, and instead of PWNAGE investing some money into R&D to make a truly unique glass pad offering, they just made the UltraGlide as close as they legally could to the KAZEMI without really trying anything new. Given how much PWNAGE pushes the envelope with their radical designs for the Stormbreaker and a lot of their upcoming products, might I add, I'm very disappointed that they took the cheap route here with the UltraGlide. It's painfully obvious the lack of R&D and time that went into this product, as the pad is literally just a KAZEMI clone. It's almost one for one, just with a slight changing to the surface so they're not infringing on GLSSWRK's copyrights. So while the UltraGlide is a good pad in terms of its performance, it just feels generic and uninspired and very rushed in a lot of ways, which is something I did not expect from a brand like PWNAGE. Now that I've said my piece about the whole cloning situation, let's talk about the pad itself next. First off, let's talk about the UltraGlide's unboxing. The UltraGlide comes in a pizza box style packaging, and inside the pad is surrounded with this same thick aerated foam we saw with the KAZEMI's packaging. This is actually a very good thing, and I'm happy to see PWNAGE do the same packaging design, as my box took a pretty nasty hit during shipping, and this thicker foam actually saved my pad from being damaged, so I'm quite happy with the overall packaging here for the UltraGlide. Under all this protective foam, we have the UltraGlide itself, which is wrapped in a plastic wrapper that's pretty easy to remove from the pad. Now the pad doesn't come with any accessories like a cleaning cloth or skates, which I'll admit is disappointing, as other glass pads have started to come with skates and some other form of accessories. This would be an area I think PWNAGE could improve on their future glass pads, but at least the packaging itself for the UltraGlide is quite good. Now in terms of sizing for the UltraGlide, the version I have here today is the 430 by 340 by 4mm, which is a rather odd size for a glass pad, kind of similar to how the IKEA glass was a weird size because it was supposed to be a serving tray. Now PWNAGE's reasoning for the weird size here is that it supposedly makes the transition from a similarly sized fabric pad to the UltraGlide easier, which is an interesting idea that we'll talk more about later in this video. Now PWNAGE does also have another version of the UltraGlide available that is 500 by 500 by 4mm, but as of recording this video, that pad is on back order, so currently you can only buy this small version. Now between the two sizes, there are a lot of difference in terms of how these pads actually feel due to the size limitations, but I'll talk more about that later on in this video. In terms of build quality and QC, since the UltraGlide is made in the same factory as the KAZEMI, the same quality we saw there is also here on the UltraGlide. Out of the box, my pad didn't have any QC issues, and over my testing it never developed any issues, which is great to see. The glass surface is the same tempered glass surface with the heat treated layering on top, and this has been perfectly manufactured and the surface has no bumps or slow spots. The base is the exact same design as the one we saw on the KAZEMI, being this hexagon silicone design, and the implementation here on the UltraGlide is good, but just like the KAZEMI, the base here on the UltraGlide isn't centered on the back of the pad, so if you flip the pad over, the off-center base is very noticeable, but since this is only on the base of the pad, this isn't the biggest issue. But overall, the quality for the UltraGlide is very good, as you'd expect for a KAZEMI clone coming from the same factory. I also wanted to quickly talk about print quality. Thicker glass pads will cause any kind of art to have a milky, distorted look, like we've seen on the GLSSWRK KAZEMI and the Lock-On Harut. The same goes here for the UltraGlide, but for whatever reason, the art itself is very blurry and pixelated, much more than we've seen on other glass pads. You can see this very clearly when you compare the edges of this pyramid design to the PWNAGE logo up at the top left of the pad. There is a massive difference in the quality here. Now, this issue appears to be an issue with the image scaling or some kind of printing issue at the factory, but the difference in the UltraGlide's print quality compared to the KAZEMI, which is made in the same factory, may I remind you, is very noticeable. Given the issues with the design here, I much would have rather seen PWNAGE invest some money into making a proper design for the UltraGlide pad. I'm really not sure why they didn't do that, or alternatively, they could have just not reused the key art from the previous Stormbreaker launches, and they could have just made like a black and white one with their logo on the top corner, kind of like what Skypad did for the 3.0. Again, I'm not really sure what happened in terms of the art here, but this reused key art from the Stormbreaker just does not look the greatest on this pad, and again makes this pad just kind of feel rushed and not really thought out very well. A properly designed art would make this pad feel significantly better all around, so hopefully we'll see some proper designs for the next iteration of PWNAGE's glass pads, but the current ones don't have the greatest design that I have a feeling a lot of people aren't going to be the biggest fans of. Given how this pad is designed to be a KAZEMI clone, unsurprisingly the performance of the UltraGlide is very solid, having a very balanced performance profile, but due to the slight changes with the UltraGlide surfacing, the UltraGlide can feel ever so slightly more controlled than the KAZEMI when you use the pad with highly controlled skates, like the Extra Pad Obsidian Air Pro skates. But even with those skate types, the difference between the UltraGlide and the KAZEMI is extremely minimal. Now, due to the balanced performance profile, the UltraGlide on paper should be usable for all aiming types, obviously best for dynamic aiming rather than static aiming, as all glass pads are, but the sizing of the UltraGlide heavily hampers usability of this pad, unfortunately. Over my testing, dynamic aiming at around 40cm per 360 felt okay on the pad, but dynamic aiming on the y-axis was quite bad, as the pad is so thin on the y-axis, it's very easy for you to run your mouse off the pad when tracking targets above or below you. For x-axis aiming, the pad felt fine at 40cm, but the y-axis performance was very poor. When it comes to static aiming, when I play more precision games on a glass pad, I generally play around 50 to 60cm per 360, and while the UltraGlide felt surprisingly good for this aim type, again I had issues with y-axis aiming, as if I had to look up or down I ran out of mouse space immediately, and on the x-axis I also found myself running my mouse off the pad as well when I did wider movements due to my higher centimeter range. So while the UltraGlide itself performs great, the 430 by 340 sizing absolutely obliterates the aiming experience with any centimeter over 40 cm. Because of this, I cannot recommend getting the 430 by 340 UltraGlide, as this size just sucks to aim on, and there's a lot of compatibility issues with centimeter per 360 ranges. Now, given all these issues with the smaller UltraGlide sizing, you might be wondering why PWNAGE even decided to release this size. Well, according to PWNAGE, one of the reasons why they decided to release the smaller version of the UltraGlide was that it was supposed to make it easier for people to transfer from a cloth pad to a glass pad, as the 430 by 340 design is similarly sized to a traditional fabric pad. Now, in theory, I understand why PWNAGE thought this would work, but in reality, as I've just explained a couple minutes ago, this does not work in any shape or form. And if PWNAGE were to actually put in some R&D time when they were developing the UltraGlide, I'm sure they would have come to the same results, that this size pad just doesn't really work that well for a glass pad. The reason for this is due to the pad's incompatibility with high centimeter per 360 ranges. If you've been using an old QCK for years and you decide to pick up the smaller UltraGlide, due to the much faster surface, you're likely going to drop your sense, increasing your centimeter per 360 so you can feel some control on the UltraGlide surface. And as I just talked about, more controlled centimeter ranges above 40 cm just do not work work here with the smaller UltraGlide. So because of all the issues with the smaller UltraGlide, I cannot recommend getting this size, as this design just has way too many downsides when using it for aiming and too many compatibility issues. You will be much better off with the 500 by 500 version, as that pad won't have any of the issues that the smaller version has, while being more compatible with more centimeter ranges, and it will also be a lot better in terms of using your arm on the pad because it's a little longer on the y-axis, so it'll actually be more comfortable to use than the smaller one as well. But while the pad does perform great and I actually do like the surfacing, the smaller sizing is just abysmal across the board. Speaking of performance, I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about the UltraGlide surfacing next. As I mentioned earlier, the UltraGlide feels pretty much one for one with the KAZEMI in terms of performance, but the surfacing itself is ever so slightly different. The UltraGlide surface layer is the same micro-textured surfacing we found in the KAZEMI. To the hand, the surfaces feel identical, and using a macro lens, you can better see just how similar the surfaces are between the UltraGlide and the KAZEMI. Now, in terms of frictions on the UltraGlide, measured using 6 of the X-ray-pad obsidian donuts on my YZL OGM V2, the UltraGlide has very low initial friction, being around a 3 out of 10, a higher dynamic friction being around a 4.5 out of 10, and a pretty low amount of braking friction being around a 3 out of 10. Comparing this to the frictions on the KAZEMI, they're all pretty much one for one. The only difference is that on very controlled skates like the X-ray-pad Obsidian Air Pros, the KAZEMI will feel slightly faster, as that slight differencing in the surface does make the UltraGlide ever so slightly controlled, but as I mentioned earlier, this is only by an extremely slight margin. I also wanted to note that due to the UltraGlide's 4mm thickness, the surface is pretty much immune to any kind of temperature variances, so hot or cold spots or very hot or cold environments won't significantly impact the performance of the UltraGlide or affect its balanced performance profile in any significant way. Lastly, keep in mind that different skate types will affect the friction values you experience here on the UltraGlide. Full-size PTFE skates, dot skates, or UHWMPE skates like the X-ray-pad Obsidian Air Pro skates will all lessen or increase the friction values you feel here on the UltraGlide, but the performance profile will remain balanced on most skate types. And speaking of skates, let's talk about skate compatibility next. Since this is a glass pad, the skate compatibility here will be pretty good across the board, but there are some notable exceptions. In terms of skate shapes, dots, donuts, speed stocks, and full-size stock skates will be fully compatible with the UltraGlide, but some skate materials might have some compatibility issues. Hardened PTFE or plastic skates like the TGX Exacts will be the best for a glass pad like the UltraGlide. You can use 100% PTFE skates like most stock skates or the X-ray pad Jade skates, but due to the harder surface, these skates will wear the fastest on glass, so the lifespan will be significantly less than the hardened or plastic skates, so it's best to stick with more hard pad optimized skates here for the UltraGlide. Personally speaking, I found the Obsidian Air Donuts to be the best, but you can test out different skates and find what suits your aim style the best. I also wanted to mention that since the UltraGlide surface is micro textured just like the KAZEMI's, the surface is very quiet on most skates, but some skate types will still be very loud, so I'd recommend getting skates that have a dampening layer in them like the X-ray pad Air series skates for use on the UltraGlide and all other hard pads to avoid issues with the high degree of audio feedback that comes from hard pads. Alright, let's talk base next. As I mentioned earlier, the UltraGlide's base is the same one we saw in the KAZEMI, being the same hexagonal silicone design. The base does perform very well, unsurprisingly, as the same base performed very well on the KAZEMI, and due to the heavier glass, it holds itself onto desktops pretty strongly, and the pad doesn't move or shift during testing. Now, the larger 500 by 500 version of the UltraGlide will perform similarly as well, just with a stronger anchoring due to that size's higher weight. My only real gripe with the base is that, as I mentioned earlier, the base itself isn't centered on the bottom of the pad, but seeing as this is on the base of the pad, this isn't the biggest issue, just something that slightly triggers my OCD just a little bit. Now, the edges of the UltraGlide are shockingly the same as the KAZEMI's edges, having a sharp 90-degree cut to them with a roundness added to the edge. Now, on the KAZEMI, I didn't mind the edges as the pad was much larger in diameter, so I could put my whole arm on the pad, but because the UltraGlide I have here is much smaller, I can't rest my entire arm on the pad due to the shortened y-axis height, so the edges of the pad are much more noticeable, and due to the 4mm thickness, the edges can be a bit of a nuisance sometimes. I found them to be the most intrusive when I was using the pad with a bare arm, as the glass edges are sticky since they're not coated with the same layering as the surface layer, so when you move your arm up and down the side of the pad, they do get kind of sticky and kind of high friction. Now, you can get around this by using an arm sleeve, which is still recommended here on the UltraGlide, but I wanted to mention this is that this is yet another downside of the smaller version, where the 500 by 500 version will not have this problem. And lastly, I wanted to quickly talk about arm sleeve usage. Now, similar to the KAZEMI, the UltraGlide is pretty resistant to moisture and that kind of stuff, so the pad doesn't get get super sticky, but if you have very sweaty hands like myself, you can still have a little bit of extra friction, specifically at the bottom of your wrist area right here. Now, because of this, I do still recommend wearing an arm sleeve here for the UltraGlide, just like I did with the KAZEMI. While you can use the KAZEMI with a bare arm, specifically on the larger version, it's still not ideal. And the same goes here for the UltraGlide, specifically with the smaller version, which, as I mentioned before, because the edges and the weird Y-axis sizing can be a little hard to move your arm up and down the pad. So just overall, while the surface is less sticky than a lot of other glass pads, I would still recommend wearing an arm sleeve for the best experience, as sometimes you may have some slight issues with the surfacing itself. Alright, well, in closing, the PWNAGE Ultra Glide is a weird pad for me. On one hand, I like the way the pad performs, but on the other hand, I really dislike the lack of R&D, effort, and time that was put into developing the Ultra Glide, and it makes me question whether this is a product I should be recommending. The fact that PWNAGE just essentially lazily cloned the KAZEMI instead of developing something unique is disappointing, especially for a brand like PWNAGE, which pushes the envelope with their mice and their designs all the time, and the obvious lack of R&D and the reused key art just makes this pad feel like an afterthought, and the fact that they even released a 430 by 340 sizing for the UltraGlide tells me all I need to know in regards to how much thought and effort was put into developing the UltraGlide. Now, in its current state, given that the GLSSWRK KAZEMI is a limited release and you can't get it without buying from aftermarket or third-party sellers, if you wanted a pad with similar performance to the KAZEMI, the 500 by 500 UltraGlide is a good pickup. Just know the design is going to be much worse than what we saw in the KAZEMI. If PWNAGE were to release an UltraGlide Gen 2 where they developed their own surface as well as designed their own art for the UltraGlide while discontinuing this god-awful 430 by 340 sizing, I'd be much more willing to recommend the UltraGlide, but in its current state and considering the lack of effort that PWNAGE put into making the UltraGlide, it's difficult for me to wholeheartedly recommend this product. But if you'd like to learn more about the UltraGlide, I will have the pad's product links down in the video description for you, so you can check those out if you're interested in learning more about the product. But that's going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much to PWNAGE for sending over the UltraGlide for me to take a look at. I greatly appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see some big improvements on the Gen 2, but we'll have to wait and see what PWNAGE cooks up. Big thank you to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, Lunaris, and Mark World. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and of course the Teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 a month. That is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, so thank you very much in advance for your support. You can also help support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, TJ Exclusives, and Met Keys to directly support the channel and help save yourself a couple bucks off your orders. Thank you again for watching my review of the PWNAGE Ultra Glide, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.